this podcast, Erika Andersen from Proteus talks about the fabric of a leader in this data-driven world. So stay tuned. Welcome everyone to Future of Data podcast. Today we have with us Erika Andersen. A brief bio. So Erika Andersen is the founding partner of Proteus, a coaching, consulting and training firm that focuses on leader readiness. Over the past 30 years, Erika has developed a reputation for creating approach in learning, business building that are tailored to challenges, goals and culture of organizations. She and her colleagues at Proteus focus uniquely on helping leaders at all levels get ready, stay ready to meet whatever the future might bring. Much of her recent work has focused on organizational visioning, strategy, executive coaching, and management and leadership development. In these capacities, she serves as consultant advisor to the CEO and top executives of a number of corporations, including NBC Universal, Facebook, Hyatt Hotels, GE, Hulu, Madison Square Garden. She also shares her insights about managing people and creating successful businesses by speaking at corporations, nonprofit groups, national associations. Her book and learning guides have been translated into Spanish, Turkish, German, French, Russian, and Chinese, and she has contributed to and been quoted in a variety of national publications, including Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, New York Times. Erika is also one of the most popular leadership blogger at Forbes.com. She is the author of Be Bad First, Get Good at Things Fast to Stay Ready for the Future, Leading So People Will Follow, Being Strategic, Plan for Success, Outthink Your Competition, Stay Ahead of Change, Growing Great Employees, Turning Ordinary People into Extraordinary Performers, and the author and the host of Proteus Leader Show, a regular podcast that offers quick, practical support for leaders and managers. With that, Erika, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So I think it's prepare leaders for future readiness. I think that's music to lot of ears nowadays, because world is evolving. Technology is dictating a lot of our evolution, and then lot of new roles are being created. A lot of new leaders are creating, even in the data world and non-data world. So first, welcome to the podcast, and why don't you sort of walk us through your journey? Like, what brought you here?
What brought me here to this specific podcast today with you?
Sure.
So I started working in the field of learning, really helping organizational learning. How do whole organizations learn? How do people in organizations learn? Almost 40 years ago, and kind of worked in other people's companies for about 10 years while I really got clear about what I wanted to do. And then almost 30 years ago, started Proteus to, as you said, really focus on helping leaders be ready for whatever comes. And that to me means skills, mindset, and that's just evolved. You know, I've had the good fortune to read these books have written these books that have done well and built this lovely company. And so I think you and I connected on either Twitter or LinkedIn, which is part of all of our world these days. And and when I heard that you're talking about big data, which is fascinating to me, although I don't know very much about it, and jobs of the future and leadership, I thought, I'm sure we have lots to talk about.
Interesting. Tell us, what do you do nowadays?
I have two business partners, so I spend some of my time running the company. I spend a lot of time talking to clients and prospective clients about how we can help them. I spend a lot of time doing executive coaching, doing vision and strategy work with organizations, helping organizations figure out how to literally make the changes they need to make to continue to be successful in the future. So a lot of coaching, a lot of consulting, and then just a lot of thinking. I think of myself as a business thinker. I have a blog at Forbes that I've had for 8 or 9 years. I'm writing a new book about change. So that's what I do.
Interesting. And what does Proteus do? If you can walk us through what do you guys do?
Well, as you and I were just talking about before, our core is leader readiness, and we have 3 practice areas that we use to do that. The first one we call strengthening leaders. So we have an executive coaching practice with a number of wonderful coaches, and we also have a team coaching, a team development practice. So strengthen leaders as individuals and in working together. Our second practice area is called clarifying vision and strategy, and we do that. We help organizations or parts of organizations get clear about the future they want to create for themselves, and then create good, real plans for getting there. And then all the things that need to, often when you get clear about the future you're trying to create, you realize that then, you may not be set up properly as an organization, or there's a lot of change that you're going to have to go through to get there. So we can help with that. And then finally, our third practice area is called building skills and knowledge. And we do a lot of leadership and management training to help people have the skills and the mindset that they need to be good leaders in the future.
Interesting. So that's fascinating, by the way. So from your vantage point, what do you see are some of the opportunities nowadays? Like, what do you see when you see a leader, or when you see a particular team getting prepared for this so-called jobs of future? What do you see some of the common challenges that they face that you help them with?
Well, if we pull the camera all the way back and not talk about specific jobs, but kind of universal challenges, and this is basically what I wrote my last book about, I've come to think that the core challenge, and therefore the core skill of the 21st century, is being able to learn new skills and new ways of operating quickly and continuously. There's a wonderful quote by Alvin Toffler, and he said this 20 or 30 years ago, where he said, the illiterates of the 21st century won't be those who can't read and write, but those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. I love that quote. I really think it's true. And, we tend to think of learning as a kind of academic thing, but I'm talking about muscular, high payoff learning. We're learning to actually behave differently and operate differently. That's hard for us as we get to be adults, because we get to be good at some things and we like being good at things, and then we don't want to have to go back to being a novice. And the way the world is now, we all have to sort of go back to being novices every day. There's always new things that we don't know yet that we have to start at the beginning to learn.
Interesting. And what are some of the things you could suggest to sort of these emerging leaders? Like, what are some of the things that someone could do to stay relevant as they're progressing in this rapidly evolving world? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, if it's not too self-referential, I can share with you the model from the Be Bad First book. So I based this book on skills that people who were really great learners, and I came to 4 mental skills that I saw them learning and using over and over again. And through the book, I used this kind of through line of Michelangelo painting the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. And I know it's 500 years old, but it's very modern. I'll tell you how that works. So the model is called ANEW, and it stands for aspiration, neutral self-awareness, endless curiosity, and willingness to be bad first. So aspiration means, we all know what aspiration means. It means wanting something. But it turns out that really good learners can make themselves want to learn things. People who aren't good learners, they go, I don't want to learn it, they're done, right? Really good learners, Michelangelo is a great example of this. When he was asked by the Pope to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he didn't want to do it. He didn't think of himself as a painter. He thought of himself as a sculptor and an architect. He kept trying to talk the Pope out of it, but, he was the Pope. So finally he just said, do this. And Michelangelo went through this whole thing of finding out, thinking about what are the benefits to me? What would be the benefits to me of doing this? And he therefore got himself excited about it. And that's what we've seen that really good learners do. When they have to learn something that they don't want to learn, they think about, okay, how would this benefit me? And they think of real benefits to them, and it gets them excited enough that they start to learn. Because basically we only learn things we want to learn. So you have to get yourself excited about it. So the second thing, neutral self-awareness. Generally, we as human beings aren't very clear about ourselves. And this is true of new leaders especially. We don't really see ourselves clearly as leaders. So you can have better and being neutral and accurate in self-awareness is essential. Because if you think you're something you're not, then you're not going to be in a good position to learn. If you think you're a better leader than you actually are, or a worse leader than you actually are, you've got to be pretty accurate, right? So one way to get more accurate is to question yourself. So how we see ourselves lives in how we talk to ourselves about ourselves, right? We say in our heads, oh, I'm great at this, or I'm terrible at this. Well, you can vet that, and scientists are good at this. Is that accurate? So when you find yourself saying, oh, I'm really good at giving my people feedback, you go, is that really accurate? How much data do I have about this? How much facts do I have that shows that maybe I don't have facts. And if you just question those things that you tell yourself about yourself, you're much more likely to come to an accurate point of view, to be a fair witness of yourself. And that puts you in a great position to learn. Third skill, endless curiosity. And sometimes scientists are good at this and sometimes not so much, but you know that when you're at your best as a scientist, you're curious, right? You just have this kind of relentless, I really want to understand that. I want to understand why it's happening and how it works and how it doesn't work. Like a child. I don't know if you have kids, but little kids are relentless. They just have to figure everything out, right? And when we get to be adults, sometimes we sort of get socialized out of that. But if we can re-engage that childhood curiosity as we approach new jobs, new situations, being a leader, new data, whatever it is, then we'll be able to learn. Curiosity is turbocharges learning. And then finally, and this is the most difficult one for most adults, being willing to be bad first. As I said before, when we get to be adults, we like being good at stuff. And when you come up to something new, you're not going to be good at it. And that's hard for us. And we try to either avoid it or pretend we're good at it but just to be able to get into that novice state and say to yourself, okay, I'm not good at this right now. And I bet I can get good at it. It's like the perfect setup. I'm not good. I acknowledge that. I want to figure out how to get good, right?
Interesting.
So that's my recommendation.
Interesting. And I think fascinating, by the way, and thank you so much for sharing that framework. It's really, really useful. One thing that I see as sort of when we talk to a lot of leaders, at least in the data science space, and I'm hoping it's the same all across as we are all evolving right now from all the technological landscape and whatever's happening. So leader can lead when they have a clear vision where they're heading to, right? So you can, if the vision is 2020, things are easy, you can go and do fun stuff and no question asked. But when things are evolving rapidly, look at how every 5 years, a lot of technologies are changing. A lot of even companies who used to be legacy companies are folding out, and sort of even the Dow Jones index is getting refreshed with companies that we have never heard of before. So when you are leading in that sort of in an era of this hyper growth, what do you suggest? Like, what are some of the things that you could suggest these new and emerging leaders? Like, what could they do?
I love that question, Vishal, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately because, as I mentioned to you before, the next book I'm writing, I'm just starting to work on it, is a book about change. And I realized that most of the common approaches to change, they approach change almost as though it's a discrete event. Okay, we're going to lift something up and move it and set it down again, and then we'll be done. And we know that's not how it works anymore. The change is continuous, as you just pointed out. So because people do need, one of the things that, you're absolutely right, one of the things that a leader really needs to provide is a sense of where we're going, what is the future. So what we've seen is that leaders have to conceive of and communicate it, that this is just a snapshot. This is what I can see from here, and we'll evolve it together. Because if the leader says, okay, this is the future, and then a year later it's not the future, then they lose credibility. But if they say, this is the future I can see now, let's continue to get clearer about it together. It's kind of like, this is a weird analogy, but in the early part of the 19th century, when Westerners were moving farther and farther, Europeans were moving farther and farther west in the United States, they didn't really know what they were going to come up against. So all they could say is, I know there's some big mountains out there that we're going to have to go over. You guys with me? Are we ready for the mountains? And then as we get closer to the mountains, we'll see more and more what's happening. But you can just do these kind of snapshots that you know you're going to have to change and build out with people. But even giving those snapshots is really important because people don't want to feel like they're just heading into, total unknown. So you have to say as much as you know.
Interesting. And what about bias? Like how because at leadership level, something have, and I see it almost every time I talk to someone that they have boatload of biases running with them because things have worked out for them in some cases, and
Yes.
that has really reinforced sort of their thinking. But when they run an organization, it's not pretty much like running as you. Because what are some of the things that what are some of the challenges that you see leaders face, and what are some of your suggestions? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, that takes us right back where we were talking about before. So getting really accurate and neutral in your self-awareness and your situational awareness. And it's the same thing. It's questioning your self-talk. Our assumptions live in how we talk to ourselves. So if you hear yourself saying, well, doing X and Y is the only way a company can succeed, then you have to say to yourself, really? Is that really true? What else could be true? And then, as good data scientists do, gather more data about what could be true, what might work. You have to really be careful to question your own biases and then get curious. Because what happens when we have strong assumptions is our curiosity stops. We go, this is the way it is. I'm done. Next. Versus saying, wait, what else could be true? What if we did this? How have other people done it? Just to really look and get curious.
Interesting. And from your vantage point, because you have been involved with leaders and leadership styles for quite some time, how has leadership evolved from the time you have started becoming one of the observers of what's happening and helping these leaders out? How has it evolved? Like, what are some of the things that you could take away as some of the signs that we really need to worry about, and some of the signs that really keep you hopeful about?
So you're welcome to disagree with this, but what I really think is that the core qualities that people look for in good leaders are timeless. And in fact, the book I wrote before this one is called Leading So People Will Follow, and it's about that. It's about what are those timeless, kind of universal, deeply wired in characteristics that people look for in leaders. And it's interesting because the way I came to these was by reading folktales and fairy tales to my children. And I saw that these ageless stories, that have been true for centuries and centuries in almost all different cultures, there's a story, we all know it. I'm sure it's I assume it's in Indian cultures, it's in Native American cultures, it's Western, that there's a story where there's a quest, right? And you're supposed to kill the dragon or save the princess or whatever it is. And usually there's 3 brothers, and the older 2 just flail and, fail. And then the younger one goes through a whole series of trials and demonstrations and saves the princess, kills the dragon, we all live happily ever after. And as I was reading the stories, I realized that there were themes that over and over again, wherever the story was from, this kid had to show the same set of qualities before he could become the king and save everybody, and we all live happily ever after. And so what those qualities are, briefly, are farsighted, which is what you and I have been talking about. They have to be able to conceive of and articulate in a compelling way that vision of the future. Passionate, which doesn't mean loud, it means deep. It means I am committed to you, to the enterprise, to the group of us getting to where we need to go, and I'm not going to be thrown off that. I'm deeply committed. I'm open, but I'm deeply committed. And then courageous, that we want leaders who will do things that are personally difficult for them for the good of the enterprise, right? And wise, which means they learn from their experience, they share that learning. Generous, this has been important to human beings for thousands of years, generous with knowledge, with resources, with wisdom, right, with responsibility, and then trustworthy, that we can really trust that they'll do what they say they're going to do. And I think those 6 things are absolutely ageless. what I've seen change over the 40 years that I've been thinking about leadership is speed. People have to do all that stuff at a much higher rate of speed. And you have to demonstrate those qualities more quickly. I mean, 40 years ago, you get a new leader and you give them a couple of years to demonstrate to you who they are. Now we've got about a week before people decide whether or not we're a good leader, right? So it's all the same stuff. We just have to show it a lot faster.
So how can they learn that fast? Like what are some of the things that you are seeing that how has some of the successful leaders kept up with the space because they have been also evolving through. So what are some of the things that you have seen?
So all this stuff connects together, I find, as I think about it. So, so I wrote this book, Leading So People Will Follow. And then when I was doing interviews about it is when I started to really understand the model for the next book, because people would say, well, okay, so then how do leaders get to be good leaders? And I said, well, there's a lot of stuff in the book about what they can do. But really what they need to do is be able to increase their aspiration, be neutrally self-aware, be endlessly curious, be willing to be bad first, because that's how you learn anything faster, including how to be a good leader, right? In my mind, anyway, it's connected together.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. That's nice. And let's go a bit in your book. Be Bad First. Why write this book?
Because of everything we've been saying, in order for us to succeed in the 21st century, I do think the single most critical skill for everyone is to be able to learn new skills and new ways of behaving and operating quickly and without a lot of resistance, and to get over our hesitation and fears and resistance to learning new things and just taking on new ways of operating. So I thought I was doing a service to humanity by writing this book.
So be bad first, right? So typically we are not often rewarded for being bad.
Exactly.
So how, why, and what really, like, how would you convince someone to break the mold and go a bit unconventional?
Okay, so here's how I'll answer that question. Because things are happening and changing so fast now, you cannot avoid being bad at new things. I mean, unless you're Mozart and you're writing symphonies when you're 4, you're going to be bad at new things. You agree with that? Anything that you've never done before, you're going to be bad at it, right?
True, yeah.
So the only way to avoid being bad at things is to, A, never try anything new. Which means you're going to be completely marginalized and you're not going to have a successful life. Or pretend that you're already good at it, which is going to blow up in your face, right? So in my mind, the only way to be successful is to get good at that initial phase of being bad at things, of being a novice. Therefore, be bad first. So if you're good at it, if you're comfortable with it, you can move through it a lot more quickly. And I'll give you a great example of this. So I knit. It's one of my many hobbies. I knit. And so I decided a couple years ago, well, I should learn how to spin too. Then I could take it all the way from sheep to garment, right? So I started trying to learn how to spin, and I tried to learn off of YouTube, and I couldn't. So I engaged a teacher. And before my first spinning lesson, I practiced my own, stuff. I practiced what I preached. And so I said to myself, okay, I was kind of nervous. I said to myself, okay, I'm going to be bad at this. I've never done it before. And actually that was hugely liberating. It was calming, and it calmed down my internal noise of like, he's going to think I'm an idiot, So I said to myself, I'm going to be bad at this, but I'm good at learning. I can learn it pretty quickly, as long as I acknowledge that I'm a novice to start with. And so that was the mindset that I went into it. And the first lesson was great. When you don't have all that stuff going on in your head about, I'm going to be terrible and they're going to think I'm an idiot, and then you just have a blank space in your head, you can learn. So I was learning pretty quickly, and by the end of the first lesson, he's like, wow, you're really picking this up quickly. And I told him what I was doing. I said, well, I came into this mindset. And my spinning teacher said, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. He said, I was trying to teach, I was giving this other woman a couple of weeks ago her first lesson, and she was a very expert weaver. So she thought she should be a good spinner. And he said it was awful. She was so frustrated because she thought she should already know it. By the end of the lesson, she was actually doing worse than she was at the beginning. And I thought that was such a great example of if you can come in with this novice mindset, yep, gonna be bad, now I can start to learn. It frees you to actually learn. Does that make sense?
That's a pretty cool example. So yes, I think it does. It definitely does. So what's the role of a business in making a good leader? Like how committed or if I'm a business and then sort of if I am responsible for churning out great leaders that probably help this business exist in this so-called jobs of future, what is the role of a business? What do you think?
Man, I super love that question. When I wrote my first book, Growing Great Employees, it was about how to be a good manager, which is different than being a good leader, but there's similarities. And one of the things I talked about a lot was how most businesses just absolutely don't help people be good managers and leaders. I mean, if you think about it, like if, let's say you're going to be a lawyer, right? So you go to law school, that takes a couple of years, and then you have to pass the bar, and then, you have to do a bunch of stuff to even get to where you get to start to be a lawyer or a social worker or a doctor or anything. The way most people in businesses get to be managers and leaders is they're just going along doing their job, and one day their boss calls them into the office and says, okay, now you have a team, good luck with that. Tell me if you have a problem. What? You're just supposed to magically know how to do it, right? So I think the most important thing that businesses can do is prepare people to manage and lead by offering them help with the skills and mindset that are necessary. There isn't that much good, but good management and leadership training that's really skill-based, that's really mindset-based, that can help you see what it means to be a leader and how to behave differently. This may sound weird, but to me, learning how to be a leader, a good manager, is not that different than learning how to be a good carpenter or ballet dancer. There are new behaviors you have to learn how to do, right? And businesses can help with that.
Interesting. And how would if I'm a leader, what should I expect the business, like what should my expectation from the business be?
Wow, I love that too. So if I do walk into my manager's office and he says, okay, you're going to be managing 3 people, my responsibility, I think, is to say, thank you very much. And what resources are available through the organization to help me do that well? That's my responsibility. And if the manager gives me a blank look, because, I don't know, really, what are you talking about? Then it's my responsibility to say, well, is it okay with you if I find some resources outside the company that can help me do that well? Rather than just assuming that you're going to automatically know how to do it because you're a smart person,
Interesting. And what about some of the bad examples that you have seen over the time, like some of the messed up culture where sort of leaders are not really churning out, they are very toxic environment. Like what are some of the things that you have seen, some of the commonalities, some of the common threads that someone should look an eye out for when they're sort of evaluating their periphery to lead?
Wow, you're asking great questions. So the first 2 things that come to mind are fear and anti-learning, and I'll explain both those more. So there are some organizations that are set up with fear as the main motivator. And what I've seen over the years, and this is supported by neuroscience, is that fear is a great short-term motivator, but it's not sustainable and it's very fragile. Like if I'm afraid of something, that will definitely motivate me not to do it or to do the opposite. But I don't like it. We don't like being afraid. So as quickly as possible, we try to get out of that situation, which is what I mean by it's fragile and it's short term. So if you find yourself looking at being a part of an organization where you can tell that the motivation is fear, and you can tell that by how people talk. If they talk about punishment and negative consequences, and that guy, he didn't work out and we just threw him under the bus. people talk that way, it's like, oh, this is going to be bad. So that's thing one. And thing two is kind of what we've been talking about all along. There are some organizations that are anti-learning organizations. And by that, I mean, they expect you to know everything and don't say when you don't know things. Like if you're looking at a job as a leader in an organization, the immediate thing to look for is that question I asked before. If you were to say to your potential boss, what resources does the organization have to help me be a better leader? If the answer you get is some version of, oh no, we're hiring you to be a good leader, you're supposed to know everything coming in. It's like, ooh, that's bad. Right?
That's true. Interesting. And what about the hallmark use case, or some of the cases where you've seen, wow, they get it? Like, what are some of the examples where you're pleasantly surprised with how they are actually nurturing the leaders? Like, what are some of the good qualities or sort of good indicators that really someone should look out for in saying, okay, you really do care of your leaders and you really help in growing them?
So it's all the things we've been talking about. So if you go into an organization and they immediately say to you, here's how we support our people's success, here's how we support our leaders' success, here are the cultural things that we put in place. If when you're going in to look for a job as a leader, right, and you ask some question like, well, how would you describe the culture here? If they have an answer to that question, and then they can tell you real stories about how that works in the day-to-day, that's a really good sign. Because a lot of people don't have any answer to that. Oh, we have a good culture. Well, what does that look like? Well, it's good. They can't really answer the question. And some people can answer it, but you can tell it's just something that only lives on the wall. We believe in teamwork, and we believe in this and that. Well, can you give me an example of that? And if they can't give you examples, that means it's not real. People, if values really live in a culture, people can tell you stories, right? So look for that. And make sure that that whatever they tell you about the kind of organization it is, that it resonates for you, because different people like different cultures. Some like cultures that are more open and loose, some like cultures that are more organized and formal. So ask questions to find out whether this is really going to be a good fit for you and your style as a person.
Interesting. And I think, so I have this one weird hypothetical, by the way, and I want to just put you through it and see how we both come out at the end of it. But I think this is we are seeing something nowadays a lot, some so-called AI, artificial intelligence, right? And we are seeing sort of lot of machines are doing a lot of the work. So on the other side, businesses are incentive for how much money they can make or they can save, right? So if the market is stagnant, so you worry about how much money you can save. So the instant sort of next best thing that could happen is, hey, let me get rid of few folks and let me replace it by machines. But if you look at how businesses have acquired people, it's a very lengthy process, and they have grown. And obviously, when you get these people into an organization, they bring their culture, they bring their diversity, they bring a lot of these mixes, sort of that intermingle to create that magic sauce that runs a company. But these machines are very stereotypical. You expect them to do something, and they do something. So when you are leading that organization and leading sort of through this change of habits, and then you know that market favors either making money or saving money, those paradigms. And how would you think the leadership evolving in this future, in this sort of in this future scenario in which machines are taking over, and there's a big incentive that every leader has to sort of save on some bottom line, or really nurture these talent pool in some directions? Like what is your perspective in that?
So there, I could say 150 things about that. So I'll just pick one or two. I mean, we could all think like Elon Musk that machines are taking over and none of us are going to have a job. I don't tend to think that's true. I think it's sort of like, okay, so put aside AI for machines. So as good leaders develop the people below them so that they themselves, the leaders, are able to operate at ever higher and higher levels, right? That's why you delegate. So if you're a good manager and you have some people, you try to teach them and help them grow to their potential so that you can give away stuff so that you can do more and more high order, interesting, necessary work. So I feel like the same dynamic is true of machines, that good leaders and this is especially true as the future goes on and machines are capable of more and more sophisticated tasks, that we're going to have to, as leaders, really think about what is uniquely human. What are human beings capable of that machines are not yet capable of? And do our best to train our people to do those things so that they don't become obsolete. I mean, I feel like, you know, you can look at it in a terrible way. It's like, oh, machines are going to take over and none of us are going to have a job. Or you can look at it like the 21st century version of, we have washing machines so that we no longer have the launder woman, you know, that they're going to take over more and more tasks that free us then to do those very sophisticated relational things that at this point anyway, only human beings can do. So I think that's the role of leaders, is to figure out what is it that we are now being freed to do, and how can I help my people be able to do that?
Interesting. And when you and by the way, thank you so much for putting yourself through this. I'm sorry I just felt I have to ask you this. So what are some of the self-check mechanisms? So if you're a leader, right? Sure, I'm a great leader. I'm awesome. People love me. That's not difficult, right? But what are some of the self-check that when you sort of evaluate a leader? What are some of how would you sort of measure that out?
So there are some good frames. I happen to think that our frame, the far-sighted, passionate, courageous, wise, generous, trustworthy, is a good frame. And to try and be really, as I said before, really accurate, not just go, oh yeah, I'm awesomely courageous. Really? Are you? Do you have any data to support that belief? But then also have what I call in that book sources. Find some people who see you clearly, who want the best for you, who are willing to tell you the truth, and ask them. Everybody should have some fair witnesses in their friend and colleague group. I have two business partners, Larry and Jeff has been my partner for 18 years, and he is my fair witness. I mean, if I go to him and say, how did I do in this regard? He loves me, and so it's always hopeful and supportive, but man, if I've screwed up, he will tell me. And we all need that. We all need, because we just, even if we have the best of intentions and we're really trying to be accurate about ourselves, we just cannot see ourselves as clearly as other people can. And so we all need some outside people who will give us that feedback.
Interesting. Because I think I suffer through this a lot. I think when sort of, when you want sort of honest opinion at some point, so you start getting some of the very predictable outcomes when you ask for a feedback, then you say, okay, maybe I'm not getting honest opinion there because everyone's saying the same thing. I want sort of some critique or some this other direction. And then sort of I started even seeing myself, I built the bias for the negative bias. So I said, okay, anyone who says negative are amazing or whatever, right? So it's a constant battle of really who should I go out at when I seek and because as a leader, you don't get too many honest opinions, and if you get, they're hidden somewhere.
In fact, I read this thing about 15 years ago that really struck me. Somebody, it might have been a century, I can't remember. Somebody did a study about why leaders fail, and the two main reasons were basically they start thinking too highly of themselves and they don't have good sources of feedback. Those were the two main reasons. So what you're saying is absolutely true. And I think you have to test your sources of feedback just like you test your sources of feedback in an experiment, right? To see whether or not it's valid over time. So that what I was saying about my partner, Jeff, I mean, I've known the guy for almost 30 years. He's been my business partner for almost 20. And not only does he always give me balanced feedback, which is really an important thing to look for, somebody who tells you all negative, not great, somebody who tells you all positive, not great, because neither of those things are ever true about anybody. So he gives me balanced feedback. And then I've seen over time, even when I didn't even agree with him, he generally turns out to be right. Right? So you have to vet your feedback to make sure that they're accurate.
Interesting. That's pretty cool. And if what are some of the self-check for companies? Like what are some of the self-check for businesses to say, hey, I can really churn out leaders for this dystopian future or this hopeful future, which however you look at this? What are
Well,
some of the subjects?
like for individuals, they have to be willing to be accurate. And what you said at the very beginning about bias and assumption, I feel like organizations are even more at the effect of that than individuals, because people are trying to, pardon my French, cover their asses, right, and not get hurt. But so you have to, as an organization, be willing to say, we want to find out the real story. We want to be accurate about ourselves. And then you have to have good metrics. You have to decide amongst yourselves, what does it mean to have good leaders? What does it mean to create good leaders? How would we know if that were true? Would their people grow faster? Would we have less turnover? Well, maybe not, because the bad ones might be staying. You really have to think about what are the actual metrics that will show you whether or not you're creating good leaders, and then be, rigorous about looking at those metrics in an accurate way. It's part of it is science.
Interesting. And I think, so one more weird behavior that I'm seeing in my side of the world nowadays is too much dependence on data. So I think whenever I talk to many of my interactions, say, hey, Vishal, don't worry, we have the stats saying that blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And my struggle is to try to figure out there is no bias in the stats, right? So that's number one, but it doesn't matter. At a leadership level, like some of their why they are leader to begin with is their intuition, or their grasp of something that is not very evident. But what data can tell us is very, very predictable. Like some observation and some things, and it is great for incremental sort of decision making. Sure, add one more box because customer wants one more box. But as Aniford says that if you ask people, they want faster horses, right?
Exactly.
So for if you're a leader in that sort of mindset where hindsight is not very clear, and I was reading this quote that whenever there's a burst of innovation, there has been big brouhaha around the world will end and there's nothing will, because the data doesn't permit that. And I think one of the hallmark research I remember was a report from McKinsey. So McKinsey was asked by AT&T, hey, I think back in 1980, that how many cell phones would you think would be sold by 2000? And they come up with 900,000. And it was 120 million. So when you are that dependent on data, you tend to miss out on the unknown unknowns.
Totally agree. And in fact, I was just having breakfast with a friend of mine this morning who, this was 15, 20 years ago when DVRs were first coming in, and she was running CBS, and they kept telling her, oh, well, there'll never be more than about 10% penetration of DVRs. This isn't something we have to worry about. She kept going, I don't think that's true. So it goes back to what we were saying before about AI, that what you're talking about are the kinds of skills that it's going to be very, very difficult. Nothing's impossible, but very difficult for machines to replicate. That ability to take data, interpret it according to experience and intuition, and come up with something fresh and new. And that's what we as human beings, I think, have to get better and better at, is starting with the data and then interpreting it in ways, taking bets on the future. This is where I think this needs to go. That's a purely human thing to be able to do. And learning how to get better at that is really key.
Interesting. Yeah, I think so. And even I think bias is something that I see a lot. I think it is very difficult to fight that off. And I think so. First I want to have your perspective, and then probably I'll yell out something that I'm seeing from some of the great leaders that I've interacted with. From your perspective, what are some of the best best examples you have seen in which leaders have really secured themselves from any of the bias creeping in? Like, what are some of your thoughts there?
The leaders that I've seen who are really good at that do that simple thing that I was talking about at the very beginning, where they just ask themselves, they rather than just saying this is the way it is, they turn that statement into a question, which is making it a hypothesis, right? Is this the way it is? So rather than saying this is the way it is, they go, is this the way it is? And then they go, what else could be true? They just keep themselves in that curious questioning mode. It's a simple thing, but it's very powerful.
Interesting. Because I think so. One of the response that I've heard about, and I think I do appreciate this particular individual. So he said that he sort of built a council. So whatever keyword he think, he just bring out people on from that council, and then every now and then he runs a meeting in which he has this consulate so called, and sort of they talk about this area, and then he just hear these people talk, and his idea is, sure, I'm not killing the bias still, but I'm minimizing the impact because there are a lot of biases coming in together. Probably it's just nullifying everyone, and then we sort of go a bit democratizing an intuitive. So it's a very sort of nerdy way to kill, or statistical way to kill a bias, which is pretty fat. I said,
You create a scattergram so that so that you end up in the best place. I mean, I agree with the core of that. I do think that it's each person's responsibility to try and unpack and see their own biases to get as clear and fair witness as possible. And I do think that for most questions that don't have pat answers, it is important to get more than one person involved because we just see things from a different point of view. As I said earlier, I have two business partners, and all three of us are wired very differently. We were just meeting together last week in Minneapolis, and we work really well together. We're very collaborative. We have tremendous respect for each other. And I think we communicate quite well. So sometimes we'll just all go, yep. But quite often we'll really have to find that point, that new different point where we all agree. And it takes us further. It takes us much further than it would have taken it just one of our brains. So I completely agree with getting a few smart, unbiased as possible people in the room to answer important questions, because you almost always get a better answer.
Interesting. And if we talk about Proteus for a few minutes, when is a right time to engage with something like you guys? Like when do you think if I'm a business, I should say, hey, maybe I should give you guys a call? Like, what is that hallmark moment and revelation that I should?
That's a great question. So if you as a business feel like we are not as good as we need to be at having our leaders be ready to lead us into the future. So that could be on an organizational level, that we're not clear about the future we want to create for ourselves. It could be on an individual level, that leaders, we're not, as you and I were talking about before, we're not preparing our leaders to be good leaders. As maybe we understand the future we want to create, but we don't know how to get there. If there's any impediment to you actually moving toward the future you want to create for yourself, you should call us.
Interesting, pretty cool. And what are some of the signatures of, or some of the qualities of a successful leader? Like, what are some of the things that you can say, hey, maybe you should, like, whenever you talk to someone, what are some of the things that you would expect these guys? And I think we talked some of these qualities, but if you want to give them a template to follow, is there anything that they could learn from?
I obviously I wrote a whole book about it, so I love it. But I love those 6 qualities, and I do think, and it's funny, while I was writing the book, the Leading So People Will Follow book, we created a multi-rater assessment, and we had it validated by a statistician, and she reinforced for us that these 6 things are highly correlated in people's minds with followability. So that made us feel good. And so I do think it's a great frame. In terms of kind of metrics, like outcomes, what do you look for if a leader is really doing well? Then I would look for both the operational metrics and the human metrics. So in my experience, good leaders create good businesses. Their businesses achieve their goals, whether it's growth or profitability or innovation. They achieve the goals they set out for themselves, and people really, really like working for them.
Interesting. Wow.
Because the more people like working for you, the more they're going to be able to do good things. And then if you as a leader know how to inspire and motivate and clarify them to do good things. So you should be able to see both those things. The business is doing well and people love working there.
Interesting. And do you have any good sort of transformative story where sort of you have really taken a messed up leader or a company and they have really set their way? Do you have any sort of walkthrough story that you can sort of navigate us through, that how actually change, how difficult it is for change to happen, and how folks have really done that?
Yeah, I mean, I have hundreds of them, obviously, because we have a dozen coaches, and I have the people I've worked with, and then we have, but without, talking about any people, right?
Right.
So one of my stories I feel very best about is a woman who was a very good leader on a business sense. She was a great operator and a real visionary in lots of ways, but just didn't have that human side, didn't understand how to connect with people, didn't really understand how to motivate people. People were incredibly impressed by her and respectful of her because she was so smart, such a good business operator. And we really helped her see the human cost of her not focusing on people and on their motivation. So she learned a lot of really basic communication skills. We helped her learn how to listen, how to really take people's point of view and incorporate it, how to, be more hopeful and positive in her feedback versus just kind of punitive. Just some simple human interaction skills. And it took what she was great at and just put in that human. And she's in the 6 years since I started working with her, she's been promoted 3 times, and now she works for the. So
I think fascinating, and I think you're bringing an interesting area that I'd love to chat with you for a few minutes on. That is female leaders, right? So I think this is another thing that I find myself into a lot. Like interestingly, so I put up a conference a while back in Boston, and I was asking. So there was a panel for women leaders in data science, and I pretty much did 100 calls to a lot of these women, and no one showed up. And it was like getting to a point where we were about to cancel that, but luckily somehow things worked together, and we ended up putting that and it's like 4 or 5 years back. But from your vantage point, like what are some of the opportunities, or what are some of the things that you are seeing for female leaders to progress? Like we are seeing some of the, sure, there's a lot of conversation happening around, but what are from your vantage point, what are some of the opportunities, and what are some of the things that you see or worried about when it comes to female leaders emerging?
So a couple of months ago, maybe 4 or 5 months ago now, I wrote a post on my blog at Forbes about women in tech companies. And I spoke to this woman who's a CMO of a tech company, and she told me about all these great things that they're doing to reduce unconscious bias in tech. And I think in some ways, the biases in tech are worse than in a lot of areas because tech has been such a male bastion, And some of the things that she talked about, I think, are important for unconscious bias, not only against women, but people of color and sexual orientation, all kinds of discrimination. She talked, for instance, I'll just give you one example that I thought was really important. They've really tried to remove the unconscious bias in their job descriptions. And what they found is that they were being so specific in their job descriptions that it made women less likely to even apply for the jobs. Because what's true is that when a man and a woman, generally speaking, it's not true, obviously, but when an average man and an average woman look at a job description, the man, if he scans through the job description and feels like he has 50% on there, he'll apply. The woman, unless she sees that she already has 90% of those capabilities, she won't apply. And so what they found is by being less specific and more kind of global in their job descriptions, they reduced their unconscious bias. And they got better candidates and more women candidates. And then that's just one example. But then they found that there were, for instance, things they were doing in terms of language, how people talk that, and I don't even mean, egregious Me Too kind of harassment stuff, but just the conversations, a lot of sports analogies, things like that. And I think if you're really serious as a company, being open to not only women, but people of color, you just have to look for those sometimes very subtle but real impediments that you're creating for people.
Interesting. So if you are a woman in an organization who is planning to grow into a leader, but find all these glass ceilings all over the place, like what are some of the things you could suggest? What are some things you could advise to at least the organization where women leaders have not yet emerged, or in minority, and in the organizations where, like, anyone who's listening and viewing this podcast, what are some of the things you could suggest to a woman to help her grow?
Well, the one really good thing is it turns out that the skills and capabilities that are important to a leader and to lead and manage well are sex neutral. They're gender neutral. And even when we were creating this assessment for leading so people will follow book, we found out that it was absolutely gender neutral when we did the validation. People don't look for different qualities from men and women leaders, that those 6 qualities are equally valued. And it's the same thing with management. So that's important to know, that just if you are a good leader, it's not, there aren't, good women leaders are not different than good men leaders. So that's important to know. The second thing I would say is if you want to be a woman leader in an organization, really look for mentors, women mentors. And if you can find those, if you can find women who are a level or 2 above you and ask, most women want to help you. And if they don't exist in your organization, then find one in a similar organization, because you want to know the person who's broken the path. You want to know what they've done to break that path. So that's really important. And then this is a little riskier, but I think it's important. If you notice that you are really being discriminated against in subtle ways, try to bring it up to people in ways that are not demanding, but just sharing your point of view. Like, for instance, this one young woman that I know, she was in a situation where she worked for a tech company. She was often the only woman in meetings. She was a kind of mid-level manager. And she would say something, and people would kind of ignore her. And then a man would say the same thing 10 minutes later and would get a response, right? So she went to her boss and she said, I want to bring something up that may be a little uncomfortable, but I just want to bring it to your attention. And then she just said what she saw. She said, I noticed that fairly often when I bring up an idea, no one responds at all. And then someone else in the meeting will bring the idea up later and people will respond to it. That's it. She just said that. So she just raised his consciousness. She didn't demand that he change. She didn't tell him she was going to HR. She just said, I noticed this. And he started to address it, because he was a good guy. So he started noticing it happen, and he would watch her say something and have people blow right past me. Ellen just said something I think is important. Let's listen to that. So sometimes just raising people's consciousness, if they're good people, is enough to make a change start to happen.
Beautiful. And Erika, thank you so much for providing your thoughts on such an important topic, and I do appreciate that. So now we're at the tail end of the conversation. So I want to spend some minutes on your journey. So I think we asked all of our guests. So in your journey, if I say 3 qualities that have really helped you stay sane and successful throughout your journey, like what would you attribute that to be? Like, what are some of those qualities that really helped you become what you are?
So people have asked me questions like this a lot, and I always say the same thing, and I really think it's true. And not only what has helped me in my journey as a professional, but what has helped me in my journey as a parent and a spouse and a citizen of the world. I think if somebody said to me, okay, of all the skills and understanding that you've come to over the years, you can only use 3 of them. The others you don't get to use. Which would they be? And the first one I always say is managing my self-talk. And that could be a whole different conversation that we don't have time to have, but I talk about it in all my books. The fact that it's what I was talking about before about accurate self-awareness. We can speak to ourselves differently. And most of our problems arise when we speak to ourselves in untrue or negative ways. When we say, you're an idiot, or you don't know how to do this, or you're perfect, or whatever. You can manage that. You can speak to yourself differently. So that's my first thing. I encourage everybody to do that. Second one is listening. I think listening is the foundation of all successful relationships. And if you really learn how to listen well, which means let go of what you're thinking about and really, really attend to what the other person's saying and try and understand it, it's the core of success as a leader, as a parent, as a salesperson, as a spouse, anything, everything, as a friend. So listening. And then the third one is curiosity. I do think curiosity is just turbocharges change and learning and openness and acceptance. And we all have it. We all, I was talking about little kids. We're all born these relentlessly, in fact, there are some scientists that think that curiosity in babies and children is a drive, like hunger and thirst, that it's so important for survival. It's how kids figure out how to operate in the world, right? And we just sort of forget it, or it gets sort of buried over when we get to be adults. And to re-engage that kind of like, and you're very curious. You ask great curious questions, and I'm sure it's a huge benefit to you to be like, oh, why does that happen? And what do you think about that? And so those are the three things: managing your self-talk, listening, and being curious. If everybody did that, it would be a better world.
Beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. So, and one other question I really am interested to learn about you is some of your reading habits. Like, what are some of the books that you have read that you like to share with our listeners and viewers?
I read a lot of fiction because I love good writing, and I feel like stories are the DNA of humanity. Stories are since the dawn of time how we've communicated important stuff. So I feel by reading good stories, I get to be a better storyteller. So I read a lot of fiction. But in terms of business books, probably my favorite business book of all time is Jim Collins' Good to Great. I love that book, and I feel like it tells timeless truths about what is important in business. So I love that book, recommend it without hesitation. And then my favorite business author is probably Dan Pink. I love every book he's written. And I just found out recently, I didn't know, he has a new book out called When, and so I'm very excited. Very
nice book, yeah. Interesting. And thank you for sharing that. So now we're at the last but not the least question of this session. If you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, what would that be? Like, what would be your closing remark to our listeners and viewers?
Be willing to be bad first, Be willing to be a novice. If you are willing to be a novice, it will just solve so many problems in your life. And you'll learn so many new things, and you'll meet so many great people who know stuff that you don't know, and just be willing to be a novice throughout your whole life. No matter how old you get, just keep being willing to be a novice.
Beautifully said. And I'm not sure about the listeners and viewers, but I will try to be bad first. So I do thank you for that interesting sort of nugget perspective that really, I find it very, very useful. So again, Erika, thank you so much for your time, being really generous with your time with our communities. You're always welcome back on the podcast. Love to have you back when the change is out, and we'll talk about that, another fun topic for a fun sort of vertical. So definitely would be interested in that. And whenever you're in Boston, let me know. Let's catch up over a coffee or something, and we can chat.
Great conversation. I just loved all your questions and all my favorite stuff to talk about. So thank you.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a